Hello, welcome to the stream. I should probably need that. All right. Now I got to do the standard ritual of asking people if they can hear me. I'm sure you can. I'm pretty sure I've got the settings right. Before we get into it, I thought I would take a moment. Hello, by the way, Color User Pro. Thank you for joining me. Aloha. Um. Oh. Uh. Oh gosh, I don't know how to pronounce Susite. Susaged. Oh yeah, thanks. Good. Awesome. Thanks, Ed, for coming by. Before I start reading the Federalist, by the way, that's what we're doing today, reading the Federalist Papers. Susu JT, thank you. Actually, that's very helpful. Sousa, like the composer, Sousa. Okay. Before we get started reading the Federalist Papers, I thought I would give a quick historical overview and talk about um, what they were for. What's the deal with Federalist Papers? Why did they exist? So, very quick chronology. The United States declared its independence in 1776 during the American Revolution, and at first it was just 13. It was 13 separate colonies, and so they just were functionally 13 separate countries. And they assembled, or they sent representatives to the Continental Congress to coordinate their military action, essentially. And the Continental Congress functioned. I talked about this a little bit when I did that video a long time ago, but it functioned as basically an international organization. Certainly, the first Continental Congress, that's definitely what it was. But as time went on, and it was responsible for doing war stuff, handling, organizing the war effort. Uh, it got more elaborate. And by the time the war was over, they had formed a formal arrangement called the Articles of Confederation, which just regulated how they would deal with each other and how they would run their what the relationship was between the central body, Congress, and the different states. And there was only Congress. Congress was the only institution associated with it. There was no executive. There was no judiciary. It had very limited powers. States were still functionally independent entities. And during the course of the 1780s, a lot of people, that was the period of time that the Articles of Confederation were in charge. There were a lot of people in the US who were starting to feel like, at least among the elites, who were starting to feel like they needed something more centralized, a stronger federal system. And there were a number of events that happened. There was Shays Rebellion. Oh, thanks for the follow. I didn't catch the name, but thank you. There were the Shays Rebellion in Massachusetts happened in 1786, I think, if I remember correctly. There was some other stuff. I probably got that date wrong. There was a bunch of other stuff happening in the 1780s. And so, in 1787, delegates from the different states came together in Philadelphia and drafted a new constitution that would replace the Articles of Confederation. This new constitution had an executive that would have the ability to enforce laws. It had Congress, now a bicameral legislature, a bicameral Congress. The old Congress was just, it had delegates from the different states, but each state had one vote. But in this new Congress, there would be senators, 2 per state, that would each have its own vote, his own vote. And then in the House of Representatives, would be apportioned by population. And then a separate judicial branch. And this was quite controversial at the time. And there was a lot of debate at the time. And the 2 factions at the time over the debate were the Federalists, who wanted the new Constitution and wanted a federal system, and the Anti-Federalists, who wanted to keep the old system, and basically have, like, the states would have more power, would have more independence. Not that they would be completely independent, but they basically wanted to keep the status quo, basically, or at least have something much weaker than what came out of Philadelphia in 1787. So the chronology is in 1787, summer of 1787 was the convention for the Congress, the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. They finished in September, and then it went to the states, and each state had to ratify it. And the debates were going on in each state individually, and each state had its own constitutional convention to either approve or deny, refuse to approve the new constitution. And 9 states had to ratify it in order for the constitution. And so the Federalist Papers were a series of newspaper editorials written by 3 statesmen at the time who had been involved with the Continental Congress: Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison. Hamilton and Madison were the 2 main authors. John Jay authored just, I think, 6 of the essays. But we'll be seeing John Jay early on because 5 of his 6 essays, or most of his essays, are at the very beginning. But then after that, it'll be just pretty much just Hamilton and Madison. And so they started publishing their editorials in October of 1787, so about a month after the Continental Congress finished. They were published in New York papers, and they were aimed basically at a New York audience. It was to persuade the people of New York to ratify the Constitution, support the new Constitution, which was not a guaranteed thing. There was a lot of opposition to the new Constitution, to the proposed Constitution in New York, and New York came very close to refusing to ratify it. It was a very close thing when they held their Constitutional Convention in Poughkeepsie. Okay, so I'm going to start reading it, and then I'll stop periodically every paragraph or so to kind of summarize what he's saying and do a little bit of commentary on it. I'm going to try to keep my personal opinions out of this and make this about the document itself. And if you have any questions, feel free to jump into chat and ask. All right, so what we're starting with here, Federalist number 1, is written by Alexander Hamilton. And hopefully I'll remember during the course of this, when we get to number 2 and number 3, I'll go in and change the little thing on there to the little name on there. Change it to Federalist number 2. Solitaire Pilot, they were all using the pseudonym of Publius. Every one of they all use the same name. Did I pass it? Here it is, Publius. That's all 3 of them use that. And this was really common at the time to use pseudonyms, often kind of Latinate pseudonyms, using kind of faux Roman names. Or actually, they were real Roman names, or Latin names, but they were just regular old Americans. But so much of the stuff that was written at the time, when one of these guys, like the founding generation or whatever, when they would write something for press, try to sway public opinion, it was almost always anonymous, or pseudonymous, I guess, pseudonyms. And oftentimes it was kind of an open secret. Sometimes you really didn't know who wrote it, or the people at the time. Sometimes people knew who wrote it, but they still used a pseudonym anyway. It was part of the culture at the time. Okay. And oftentimes they would pick names that were kind of like had meaning. Can't think of any examples right now, but they would pick a name that that evoked something from classical literature that was like consistent with the theme of the guy, of what he was going for. Anyway, so what he's doing here in Federalist number 1 is he's kind of laying out, it's basically an introduction to all the Federalist Papers. He's laying out what his program is, what he's going to try, because Hamilton's kind of the ringleader of this, but he's laying out to the person, like, I'm going to be beginning this series. I, Publius, I'm going to be beginning this series, and this is what I'm going to try to cover. This is why. All right, so let's begin. Federalist number 1. After an unequivocal experience of the inefficacy of the subsisting federal government, so that's a reference to the Articles of Confederation. Yes, Ed, any particular reason why 18th century authors? I'm not sure why they would do that pseudonym thing. I think it might have had to do with propriety, like not seeming like you're descending down to the level of having an argument, maintaining your lofty kind of, airs or whatever. I'll have to look into that. I can't remember. I'm sure I've read about it at one time, but I don't remember. Thing is, like after a while you get so used to seeing it, you forget, it just becomes natural. And I think that's probably what happened to people at the time too. They're just so used to it, they don't even think about why they did it. After an unequivocal experience of the inefficacy of the subsisting federal government, you are called upon to deliberate on a new constitution for the United States of America. The subject speaks its own importance, comprehending in its consequences nothing less than the existence of the Union, the safety and welfare of the parts of which it is composed, the fate of an empire in many respects the most interesting in the world. It has been frequently remarked that it seems to have been reserved to the people of this country, by their conduct and example, to decide the important question whether societies of men are really capable or not of establishing good government from reflection and choice, or whether they are forever destined to depend for their political constitutions on accident and force. If there be any truth in the remark, the crisis at which we are arrived may with propriety be regarded as the era in which that decision is to be made, and a wrong election of the part we shall act may, in this view, deserve to be considered as the general misfortune of mankind. So no pressure. What he's saying here reflects, Americans have a reputation of thinking of their own country as being extremely important. And it goes all the way back to the beginning of the country. This took on almost messianic importance. That's maybe too strong of a word, but Americans at the time when they were forging this new country, creating this new government, they really did believe that this was one of the major moments in human history. We're going to create a government that is, in Lincoln's words, by the people, for the people. And this was this new departure from the way things had been done before. There had been republics before, but not like this. And they'll get into this a little bit in some of the later essays in the Federalist Papers. But this idea of what they were venturing on was this very important experiment. And here Hamilton is saying that right here in the first paragraph. This is a big deal. And if we fail, he says, it'll be considered as the general misfortune of mankind. Okay. This idea will add the inducements of philanthropy to those of patriotism to heighten the solicitude which all considerate and good men must feel for the event. In other words, we care about this new constitution and about creating a new government and about resolving the problem of the Articles of Confederation, not just because we're patriotic, is what Hamilton is saying, not just because we care about our country, but because we're being philanthropic. We care about the well-being of mankind, and mankind in general is depending on us to, do this right and establish this government successfully. Happy will it be if our choice should be directed by a judicious estimate of our true interests, unperplexed and unbiased by considerations not connected with the public good. But this is a thing more ardently to be wished than seriously to be expected. The plan offered to our deliberations affects too many particular interests, innovates upon too many local institutions, not to involve in its discussion a variety of objects foreign to its merits, and of views, passions, and prejudices little favorable to the discovery of truth. Among the most formidable of the obstacles which the new Constitution will have to encounter may readily be distinguished the obvious interest of a certain class of men in every state, to resist all changes which may hazard a diminution of the power, emolument, and consequence of the offices they hold under the state establishments. So he's, at this point in the essay, he's kind of addressing the anti-federalists. And he's going to do that further on too. He's going to continue doing this, but he's kind of addressing the fact that anti-federalists are out there. They're in opposition to the new Constitution, and here are the reasons why. So, or at least he's going to put words in their mouth and say why he thinks that they're opposed to it. Hey, Eric, thanks for joining us. Yeah, that's funny. Yeah, yeah, that's right. It's definitely a cultural difference. Okay. So first of all, he's kind of Hamilton's implying here that a lot of this opposition to the Constitution is going to come from just vested interests, people who will stand to have, like, they're not going to benefit personally from it, even though this would be of benefit to the general welfare. Where was I? And the perverted ambition of another class of men who will either hope to aggrandize themselves by the confusions of their country, or will flatter themselves with fairer prospects of elevation from the subdivision of the empire into several partial confederacies. It's actually a pretty damning thing to say, that these individuals, some of them would be so cynical as to want the country to fail because it would give them personal political opportunities. That's what he's saying here in part. Subdivision of the empire into several partial confederacies rather than from its union under one government. It is not, however, my design, Hamilton says, to dwell upon observations of this nature. Because he's too much of a gentleman. I am well aware that it would be disingenuous to resolve indiscriminately the opposition of any set of men merely because their situations might subject them to suspicion and to interested or ambitious views. Candor will oblige us to admit that even such men may be actuated by upright intentions, and it cannot be doubted that much of the opposition which has made its appearance, or may hereafter make its appearance, will spring from sources blameless at least, if not respectable. Honest errors of minds led astray by preconceived jealousies. So, he's saying not everyone is going to be opposed to the new Constitution or the proposed Constitution because of selfish interests. Some of them genuinely want what's best for the country, but they just have the wrong idea of how to achieve that. So numerous indeed, and so powerful are the causes which serve to give a false bias to the judgment, that we, upon many occasions, see wise and good men on the wrong as well as on the right side of questions of the first magnitude to society. This circumstance, if duly attended to, would furnish a lesson of moderation to those who are ever so much persuaded of their being in the right in any controversy. And a further reason for caution in this respect might be drawn from the reflection that we are not always sure that those who advocate the truth are influenced by purer principles than are their antagonists. Ambition, avarice, personal animosity, party opposition, and many other motives not more laudable than these are apt to operate as well upon those who support as upon those who oppose the right side of a question. So, he's acknowledging that people who are in favor of the proposed Constitution and a stronger federal government could well be motivated by base motives just as well as anti-federalists could. Were there not even these inducements to moderation, nothing could be more ill-judged than that intolerant spirit which has at all times characterized political parties. For in politics as in religion, and I guess I should stop and address this idea of political parties, because it had a different connotation then than it has now. Back then, a political party was always a bad thing. The way people thought was, you have people who are desirous for the well-being of the country, and then you have a little selfish faction that just wants to do well for themselves and forget everybody else. And that was the idea of what a party was. And so this was in 1787 when he's writing this. In the 1790s is when the first American political parties started to emerge. But at first, both sides, they were called Federalists and Republicans. Both sides were in denial that they were a party. They would call the other side a party, but they would not call themselves a party. Until eventually, in the course of the 1790s, Jefferson started embracing the term party, and saying, well, actually, it's a good thing for there to be parties. And there was some beginning of an idea among the Republican faction that maybe political party is not a bad thing. But that's in the future. Still, at this point, anytime you see the phrase political party or faction, it's always a negative connotation. All right, let me get caught up on the chat here. Yeah, I agree with Sousa. If they lost revolution, they would be called manifestos. I agree. Yes. Yep. Okay. Party boy Jefferson in more ways than one, actually. All right. For in politics, as in religion, Hamilton continued, it is equally absurd to aim at making proselytes by fire and sword. Heresies in either can rarely be cured by persecution. Okay. And yet, however just these sentiments will be allowed to be, we have already sufficient indications that it will happen in this as in all former cases of great national discussion. A torrent of, and so he's predicting what's going to happen. Actually, I mean, it's not a difficult prediction to make in October of 1787, but he's saying emotions are going to be very high. People are going to say a lot of mean things. There's going to be a lot of vicious back and forth and argumentation, and people going in the newspapers and writing nasty editorials about the other side in debate, all of which happened. The constitutional conventions were held on the state level. The state conventions, when they were ratifying the Constitution, many of them had very heated discussions. So what he's saying here is very much, he's saying this is going to happen. It definitely happened. A torrent of angry and malignant passions will be let loose. To judge from the conduct of the opposite parties, we should be led to conclude that they will mutually hope to evince the justness of their opinions, and to increase the number of their converts by the loudness of their declamations, the bitterness of their invectives. An enlightened zeal for the energy and efficiency of government will be stigmatized as the offspring of a temper fond of despotic power and hostile to the principles of liberty. So, it's a way of kind of diffusing the criticism, to name the criticism, to kind of like identify it and call it out. What he's saying here, I mean, it was something that Anti-Federalists said. Anti-Federalists would say that the whole idea of the Constitution is just to create a new dictatorship. They didn't use the words dictatorship. They would say things like tyranny and despotism, but that's all the same thing, right? This is all about taking away the freedoms that Americans had won in the Revolutionary War. And so he's saying, yeah, people are going to say that about the pro-Constitution, or the Federalist side. People are going to say that about them. An over-scrupulous jealousy of danger to the rights of the people. An over-scrupulous jealousy of danger to the rights of the people, which is more commonly the fault of the head than of the heart, will be represented as mere pretense and artifice, a stale bait for popularity at the expense of public good. It will be forgotten, on the one hand, that jealousy is the usual concomitant of violent love, and that the noble enthusiasm of liberty is too apt to be infected with a spirit of narrow and illiberal distrust. On the other hand, it will be equally forgotten that the vigor of government is essential to the security of liberty, that in the contemplation of a sound and well-informed judgment their interests can never be separated, and that dangerous ambition more often lurks behind the specious mask of zeal for the rights of the people than under the forbidding appearance of zeal for the firmness and efficiency of government. History will teach us that the former has been found a much more certain road to the introduction of despotism than the latter, and that those men who have overturned the liberties of republics, the greatest number, have begun their career by paying an obsequious court to the people, commencing demagogues and tyrants. It was pretty wordy, but I think this is a good articulation of the Federalist position, the way it continued to exist during the 1790s and into the 1800s as an opposition to what later became the Republican position. A Republican, 1790s Republicanism, Jeffersonian Republicanism, in other words, what later evolved into the Democratic Party. Let's go back and parse this a little bit. Or should I? Okay. A dangerous ambition more often lurks behind the specious mask of zeal for the rights of the people than under the forbidding appearance of zeal for the firmness and efficiency of government. In other words, the anti-federalist position was that the federalist position, a stronger constitution, is a danger of creating a tyranny. But from Hamilton's point of view, and from the point of view of federalists in general, include people like John Adams, John Jay, you're more likely to get tyranny from appeal to the people, from populism, essentially, what we would call populism, or what they would call demagoguery. That appealing to the popular liberty, appealing to popular rights, and like the people, the voice of the people as a whole, is, from Hamilton's point of view, from the Federalist point of view, a more sure path to tyranny than advocating for a stronger government. And he says in the next sentence that he's got the receipts. He can back that up. History teaches us this. You can look at past examples and see that. All right. Moving on to the next paragraph. In the course of the preceding observations, I have had an eye, my fellow citizens, putting you upon your guard against all attempts, from whatever quarter, to influence your decision in a matter of the utmost moment to your welfare by any impressions other than those which may result from the evidence of truth. You will, no doubt, at the same time, have collected from the general scope of them that they proceed from a source not unfriendly to the new Constitution. Yes, my countrymen, I own to you that after having given it an attentive consideration, I am clearly of opinion it is your interest to adopt it. It's probably worth remembering with the Federalist Papers, because in American culture, we kind of, those Americans who are kind of aware of the Federalist Papers and pay attention to it is kind of regarded as this sort of like lofty philosophical set of documents, this like deep political philosophy, well reasoned, well thought out kind of thing. And I guess it is, but it was a polemical work, or a set of polemical works. These were newspaper editorials designed to persuade people to support the Constitution. They weren't written in an ivory tower just for the pure joy of the abstract reasoning about political principles. And he's laying it out right here. Like, my whole point, he's saying, is to persuade you to support the Constitution because I've given it careful thought and I've decided this is the best thing. He goes on to say, I am convinced that this is the safest course for your liberty, your dignity, and your happiness. I affect not reserves which I do not feel. I will not amuse you. And what he means by that is, I'm not going to, what he's saying is, I feel passionate about this. I'm not going to pretend to be reserved and to be like calm and cool and collected about it for the sake of appearances. I feel deeply about this, Hamilton says, and so I'm going to express it that way. I affect not reserves which I do not feel. I will not amuse you with an appearance of deliberation which I have decided when I have decided. In other words, I'm not going to pretend to be thinking it over and like weighing the options when I've already made up my mind. I frankly acknowledge to you my convictions, and I will freely lay before you the reasons on which they are founded. The consciousness of good intentions disdains ambiguity. I shall not, however, multiply professions on this head. My motives must remain in the depository of my own breast. My arguments will be open to all, and may be judged of by all. They shall at least be offered in a spirit which will not disgrace the cause of truth. All right, let me get caught up on the chat here. Yes, I agree, Souza. People have the same reaction. The writing style, the writing style itself gives modern people the perspective that it's super philosophical. People feel the same way about Shakespeare, like they think because Shakespeare sounds really lofty and really fancy and stuff that talking about serious thing, when usually it's just a sex joke or, it's something, a double entendre or something. All right. I propose in a series of papers to discuss the following interesting particulars. So here he's laying out basically his outline. Or like here, he's like, here's what I'm going to cover, or I Publius, here's what we're going to cover in the Federalist Papers, laying out his outline. Now, they don't follow this exactly. I'll explain in a sec, but this is his outline. Number one, the utility of the Union to your political prosperity. That's the first point he's going to make, that the Union is necessary. In other words, having this stronger federal government, it's all about unifying the states and creating a union. So the Union is in your best interest, in the best interest of the people for their political prosperity. Number two, the insufficiency of the present Confederation to preserve that Union. So union in general is a good idea, is his first point. Number two, we currently have a system, and the anti-federalists are saying the current system's fine. We don't need to change it. So in point two, he's going to address that. In point number two, the insufficiency of the present Confederation. The Articles of Confederation is not sufficient to preserve the Union. Then number three, the necessity of a government at least equally energetic with the one proposed to the attainment of this object. In other words, even if we don't pass this particular constitution, we need a form of government on a similar level of centralization as this constitution. And then number four, its analogy. Did I miscount? Utility, one, efficiency, necessity of government at least equally energetic. Oh yeah, and here, number four, the conformity of the proposed constitution to the true principles of republican government. In other words, if you value a republic, if that's really what you want, this constitution is in keeping with the principles of government. Then number five, its analogy to your own state constitution, the state constitution of New York. And then lastly, number six, the additional security which its adoption will afford the preservation of that species of government to liberty and property. Now, what actually happens in the course of the Federalist Papers, they cover, number one, the utility of the Union for a while. A bunch of the papers cover what's a union good for, why should we have a union. Then there's a whole series of essays that talk about how the insufficiency of the Articles of Confederation. And then this point number three, they cover that in several essays. Then we get to number four, the conformity of the proposed constitution to the true principles of republican government. They go on and on and on about that. There's a ton of essays that go into this and elaborate on this. And in the course of those essays, they break down, they go through the proposed constitution point by point. So they'll have an extended discussion of Congress, Congress and its powers as proposed in the Constitution, bicameral legislature, all the different features. What's great about how we have separation of separation of powers. I talk about the two, why it's so great that we have this the Delaware Compromise, I think it was called, where there was the Senate and the House, and then they go into the Article 2 is the executive branch, right? Where they talk about the presidency and powers of the presidency and justifying why we're giving the president the powers, and then talking about the judiciary. They go through all that for a bunch of essays. Then at the very end, very end, in number 85, which is the very last Federalist paper, they talk about points 5 and 6. So I think what happened was in the course of writing the Federalist Papers, they kind of just, I don't know, the things evolved. He wrote this before they had planned out the whole thing. In the progress of this discussion, I shall endeavor to give a satisfactory answer to all the objections which shall have made their appearance that may seem to have any claim to your attention. It may perhaps be thought superfluous to offer arguments to prove the utility of the Union, a point no doubt deeply engraved on the hearts of the great body of the people in every state, and one which, it may be imagined, has no adversaries. But the fact is that we already hear it whispered in the private circles of those who oppose the new Constitution, that the 13 states are of too great extent for any general system. What do you mean? In other words, the states are too big for us to combine them together and make and that we must of necessity resort to separate confederacies of distinct portions of the whole. This doctrine will, in all probability, be gradually propagated, till it has votaries enough to countenance open avowal of it. For nothing can be more evident to those who are able to take an enlarged view of the subject than the alternative of an adoption of the new Constitution or a dismemberment of the Union. It will therefore be of use to begin by examining the advantages of certain evils and the probable dangers to which every state will be exposed from its dissolution. This shall accordingly constitute the subject of my next address. Publius. That's Federalist number 1. Let's take a break. Let me quick check the chat. Okay. So let's go on to number 2. I'm hoping tonight to do the first 3. But that was my plan, do the first 3. All right, so at this point, how long between each publication? At first, they were publishing twice a week. And then after a little while, they started going to like 4 times a week and then 3 times a week. And that was that kind of schedule. Multiple times a week it was appearing. They were first publishing in a paper that was a bi-weekly. So it was every issue of that paper. And then they started going into other papers too to get them all. So they started in October of 1787, and they finished up like in the spring of 88. I don't remember exactly when in 88, like May or something of 88. They went through all 85. Okay. So now we're getting the first one. Oh, yeah, let me change this. The first one was written by Hamilton. This one is written by John Jay. Let me change this. We're off to Federalist number 2. Okay. All right. Number 2. John Jay has I like his style. He writes a little bit differently than Hamilton does. He had this grand sweeping vision of America, which is kind of cool to read, I think. All right, so Federalist number 2. When the people of America reflect that they are now called upon to decide a question which in its consequences must prove one of the most important that ever engaged their attention, the propriety of their taking a very comprehensive as well as very serious view of it will be evident. Nothing is more certain than the indispensable necessity of government, and it is equally undeniable that whenever and however it is instituted, the people must cede to it some of their natural rights, in order to vest it with requisite powers. It is well worthy of consideration, therefore, whether it would conduce more to the interest of the people of America that they should to all general purposes be one nation under one federal government, or that they should divide themselves into separate confederacies and give to the head of each of the same kind of powers which they are advised to place in one national government. In other words, we're going to have a government anyway. Having government always involves ceding some of your natural rights to the government, act on your behalf. So you're going to cede it to the state, or you're going to cede it to the federal government. Either way, you're going to have a government. Jay continues, it has until lately been a received and uncontradicted opinion that the prosperity of the people of America depended on their continuing firmly united, and the wishes, prayers, and efforts of our best and wisest citizens have been constantly directed to that object. But politicians now appear who insist that this opinion is erroneous, that instead of looking for safety and happiness in union, we ought to seek it in a division of the states into distinct confederacies or sovereignties. However extraordinary this new doctrine may appear, it nevertheless has its advocates, and certain characters who were much opposed to it formerly are at present of the number. Whatever may be the arguments or inducements which have wrought this change in the sentiments and declarations of the gentlemen, it certainly would not be wise in the people at large to adopt these new political tenets without being fully convinced that they are founded in truth and sound policy. It has often given me pleasure to observe that independent America was not composed of detached and distant territory, but that one connected, fertile, wide-spreading country was the portion of our Western sons of liberty. Providence has, in a particular manner, blessed it with a variety of soils and productions, and watered it with innumerable streams, for the delight and accommodation of its inhabitants. A succession of navigable waters formed a kind of chain round its borders, as if to bind it together, while the most noble rivers in the world, running at convenient distances, sent them with highways for the easy communication of friendly aids, and the mutual transportation and exchange of their various commodities. In other words, in this paragraph, he's saying it's like natural for the country to be unified, because the geographical landmass itself lends itself to being the land of a single country. With equal pleasure, I have as often taken notice that Providence has been pleased to give this one connected country to one united people, a people descended from the same ancestors, speaking the same language, professing the same religion, attached to the same principles of government, very similar in their manners and customs, and who, by their joint counsels, arms, and efforts, fighting side by side throughout a long and bloody war, have nobly established their general liberty and independence. So you have in the previous paragraph, you have the geographical unity that lends itself to having a single country. And then in this paragraph, he says there's a demographic unity, like a cultural unity of the people. The people themselves form a single people naturally. They already are. This, to me, when I read this, it reminds me of nationalism. Now, nationalism at this point is a very nascent idea. I don't know how often sentiments like this were expressed in the 18th century, but I would guess this might be one of the earliest expressions of it. The idea you have single people that are unified, they share, how does he put it here? Same ancestors, very nationalistic thing. Speaking the same language, same religion, and that's a little bit, like Christianity. There was a variety of denominations. There were Methodists, there were Anglicans, Baptists. So it wasn't exactly the same. No. I think John Jay was Anglican, or what later became Episcopalians after the Revolution. Same ancestors, speaking the same language, professing the same religion, attached to the same principles of government. And then also in similar manners and customs. Those are all things that a national, like an ethnos, share. And also they had gone through a same experience. They had all gone through this experience together of fighting for their freedom in the American Revolution. We'll ignore the loyalists. They weren't part of this. All of us Americans were fighting for revolution, for independence. All right. This country and this people seem to have been made for each other. I love that line. And it appears as if it was the design of Providence that an inheritance so proper and convenient for a band of brethren, united to each other by the strongest ties, should never be split into a number of unsocial, jealous, and alien sovereignties. It would be against our very nature. It would do violence to our very beings, to disunite us into these different states. Similar sentiments have hitherto prevailed among all orders and denominations of men among us. For all general purposes, we have uniformly been one people, each individual citizen everywhere enjoying the same national rights, privileges, and protection. As a nation, we have made peace and war. As a nation, we have vanquished our common enemies. As a nation, we have formed alliances and made treaties, and entered into various compacts and conventions with foreign states. A strong sense of the value and blessings of union induced the people, at a very early period, to institute a federal government to preserve and perpetuate it. They formed it almost as soon as they had a political existence, nay, at a time when their habitations were in flames, when many of their citizens were bleeding, and when the progress of hostility and desolation left little room for those calm and mature inquiries and reflections which must ever precede the formation of a wise and well-balanced government for a free people. It is not to be wondered at that a government instituted in a time so inauspicious should on experiment be found greatly deficient and inadequate to the purpose it was intended to answer. In other words, he's saying the Articles of Confederation were great, but they were created in the midst of chaos and war, like being actually attacked by British forces. And of course, Articles of Confederation aren't perfect. They were created under those really terrible situations, those difficult conditions. So as great as they are, we have an opportunity now in peacetime to create something that's better, more thought out. This intelligent people perceived and regretted these defects. Still continuing no less attached to union than enamored of liberty, they observed the danger which immediately threatened the former and more remotely the latter, and being persuaded that ample security for both could only be found in a national government more wisely framed, they, as with one voice, convened the late convention at Philadelphia to take that important subject under consideration. This convention, composed of men who possessed the confidence of the people, and many of whom had become highly distinguished by their patriotism, virtue, and wisdom, times which tried the minds and hearts of men, undertook the arduous task. In the mild season of peace, with minds unoccupied by other subjects, they passed many months in cool, uninterrupted. I'm sorry. It wasn't. They argued and stuff, and the room was very hot. They got really cranky. Anyway, John Jay says, in the mild season of peace, with minds unoccupied by other subjects, they passed many months in cool, uninterrupted, and daily consultations. And finally, without having been awed by power or influenced by any passions except love for their country, they presented and recommended to the people the plan produced by their joint, very unanimous council. Admit, so is the fact, that this plan is only recommended, not imposed. Yet let it be remembered that it is neither recommended to blind approbation nor to blind reprobation, but to that sedate and candid consideration which the magnitude and importance of the subject demand, and which it certainly ought to receive. But this, as was remarked in the foregoing number of this paper, is more to be wished than expected, that it may be so considered and examined. So he's repeating a little bit of what Hamilton said in number 1, which is, we need to have calm, cool heads and think about this rationally. Nevertheless, there are going to be people who are going to freak out and say a bunch of incorrect things, inaccurate things about this. Experience on a former occasion teaches us not to be too sanguine on such hopes. It is not yet forgotten that well-grounded apprehensions of imminent danger induced the people of America to form the memorable Congress of 1774. That body recommended certain measures to their constituents, and the event proved their wisdom. Yet it is fresh in our memories how soon the press began to teem with pamphlets and weekly papers against those very measures. Not only many of the officers of government, who obeyed the dictates of personal interest, but others, from a mistaken estimate of consequences, the undue influence of former attachments, or whose ambition aimed at objects which did not correspond with the public good, were indefatigable in their endeavors to persuade the people to reject the advice of that patriotic. Many indeed were deceived and deluded, but the great majority of the people reasoned and decided judiciously, and happy they are in reflecting that they did so. So he is calling to mind the creation of the First Continental Congress in 1770. And he's, from the standpoint of 1787, of course, anyone who's left are the winners. The loyalists were all chased out, and of course, the U.S. won the war, got their independence. There was a general feeling of the revolution was a good thing. And so he's invoking that here and tying the feelings about the revolution and what a good thing that was with what a good thing the Constitution. And look at what happened. Even though it was so good that we created this Continental Congress and we got this, we got our independence in the Revolutionary War. Even with all that, there was so much opposition to the Continental Congress. And so he's casting the Anti-Federalists of 1787 as the same characters as the people who opposed Continental Congress back in 1774. So he's doing kind of rhetorical thing there. Basically, both sides of the debate, the Anti-Federalists versus Federalists, both tried to claim the mantle of the true carriers on of the spirit of 1776, like the spirit of the revolution, and accuse the other side of not being in conformity with what Americans have been fighting for 1774 through 1781. Okay. I think, yeah, I'm just going to finish this up and then I'll go to the chat. They considered that the Congress was composed of many wise and experienced men. He's saying back in 1774, the people, when they wisely supported the effort for independence and what the Congress was doing, they considered that the Congress was composed of many wise and experienced men, that being convened from different parts of the country, they brought with them and communicated to each other a variety of useful information. That in the course of the time they passed together in inquiring into and discussing the true interests of their country, they must have acquired very accurate knowledge on that head. That they were individually interested in the public liberty and prosperity, and therefore that it was not less their inclination than their duty to recommend only such measures as after the most mature deliberation they really thought prudent and advisable. I can't help but feel here that he's doing the Federalist thing of being like your betters know what's good for you kind of thing, which sounds really harsh in modern culture, but it was not such a weird idea back in the 18th century. But he's invoking many wise and experienced men, and then down at the end he's like, these men desired public liberty and prosperity. They knew it was their duty to recommend only such measures as after the most mature deliberation. So he kind of trusts the framers of the Constitution to have the people's best interest at heart. I don't think that's the only way to read this paragraph. It sounds actually kind of negative in light of modern culture. That's what really stands out to me anyway. These and similar considerations then induced the people to rely greatly on the judgment and integrity of the Congress, and they took their advice notwithstanding the various arts and endeavors used to deter and dissuade them from it. But if the people at large had reason to confide in the men of that Congress, few of whom had then been fully tried or generally known, still greater reason have they now to respect the judgment and advice of the convention, the Constitutional Convention that met 13 years later in Philadelphia. For it is well known that some of the most distinguished members of that Congress, who have been since tried and justly approved for patriotism and abilities, and who have grown old in acquiring political information, were also members of this convention, carried into it their accumulated knowledge and experience. In other words, if you think the members of the First Continental Congress were heroes, did the right thing for the country, how much more should you think that was true of the men who met at Philadelphia in 1707? It is worthy of remark that not only the first, but every succeeding Congress, as well as the late convention, have invariably joined with. So Congress is here, like each session is counted as a separate Congress. That's what he's referring to. Not only the first Congress, but every succeeding Congress, as well as the late Constitutional Convention, have invariably joined with the people in thinking that the prosperity of America depended on its union. To preserve and perpetuate it was the great object of the people in forming that convention, and it is also the great object of the plan which the convention has advised them to adopt. With what propriety, therefore, or for what good purposes, are attempts at this particular period made by some men to depreciate the importance of the Union? Or why is it suggested that 3 or 4 confederacies would be better than one? I am persuaded in my own mind the people have always thought right on this subject, and that their universal and uniform attachment to the cause of the Union rests on great and weighty reasons, which I shall endeavor to develop and explain in some ensuing papers. They who promote the idea of substituting a number of distinct confederacies in the room of the plan of the convention seem clearly to foresee that the rejection of it would put the continuance of the Union in the utmost jeopardy. That certainly would be the case, I sincerely wish that it may be as clearly foreseen by every good citizen that whenever the dissolution of the Union arrives, America will have reason to exclaim in the words of the poet, "Farewell, a long farewell to all my greatness." All right, let's get caught up in the chat here. Hamilton probably published first because he was sort of, what would be the term now? He was like the editor or whatever. Like in academia, you have the guy. I'm using an academic analogy. You know, like in academia, you'll have like a collection of papers that'll be published together, and you'll have one guy who kind of like organized everything, and since he organized everything, he gets to write the first one. It's kind of how I see the Hamilton writing number one. He was the guy who was like the ringleader. I'm sure you want to watch me read. I don't know. I've come in a target account. Did the public readers know that Publius is different people at the time? That's a good question. I suspect not. I'm not sure. I'll have to look into that and see. I'll have to look into that. That's a really good question. All right, so now we're going to move on to number 3. So let me change this. Federalist number. Also written by John Jay. All right. So, it is not a new observation. The people of any country, if, like the Americans, intelligent and well-informed, of course an American would say that. He's kind of buttering up his audience a little, but I have no doubt that John Jay actually believed this about America. It is not a new observation that the people of any country, if, like the Americans, intelligent and well-informed, seldom adopt and steadily persevere for many years in an erroneous opinion respecting their. That consideration naturally tends to create great respect for the high opinion which the people of America have so long and uniformly entertained of the importance of their continuing firmly united under one federal government, vested with sufficient powers for all general and national purposes. He's here doing a thing that pretty much everyone at the time did. And as I recall, he'll come back to this again. He's like, everybody wants this. There was no polling at the time. There were no opinion polls at all whatsoever. Opinion polling didn't start to become a thing until the beginning of the 20th. So we have no idea what the percentages of people were who were in support of the Constitution or against it. But consistently, the Federalists said, people want the Constitution. This is what the people want. So kind of claiming a role of being the voice of the people. And people on the other side did the same thing. And then later on in the 1790s, when you had these new factions, Federalists and Republicans, who both are the intellectual heirs of the Federalist side of this debate. Not even intellectual heirs, the exact same people. The very people, the 3 authors of the Federalist Papers, you have Hamilton and Madison. Those became 2 leading figures in the 2 factions. Hamilton was a leading Federalist in the 1790s. Madison was a leading Republican. And they became bitter political enemies during the Washington administration. But both sides would always say, this is what the people want. What we are for is what the people want. And that's what he's saying here in this paragraph. The people are never wrong, at least not for very long. The people want the Constitution. Therefore, the Constitution is a good idea. All right, next paragraph. The more attentively I consider and investigate the reasons which appear to have given birth to this opinion, the more I become convinced that they are cogent and conclusive. Among the many objects to which a wise and free people find it necessary to direct their attention, That of providing for their safety seems to be the first. Safety of the people doubtless has relation to a great variety of circumstances and considerations, and consequently affords great latitude to those who wish to define it precisely and comprehensively. At present, I mean only to consider it as it respects security for the preservation of peace and tranquillity, as well as against dangers from foreign arms and influence, as from dangers of the like kind arising from domestic causes. As the former of these comes first in order, it is proper it should be the first discussed. Let us therefore proceed to examine whether the people are not right in their opinion, again invoking the people, saying the people want this, that a cordial union under an efficient national government affords them the best security that can be devised against hostilities from abroad. So the first part of the Federalist Papers is about why we need a union, and the first reason we need a union is protection. Protection, there's protection from foreign invasion. There's protection from, which is what he's going to talk about here, and in the next few essays is going to be protection from foreign invasion, how the Union protects us from that. And then after this, there will be essays that talk about how the Union protects us from interstate war, the different states getting into conflict with each other. And then after that, we'll get to in subsequent essays how a stronger union protects us from insurrections, rebellions, and like within a state. So he's starting with protection from outside invasion from other countries. The number of wars which have happened or will happen in the world will always be found to be in proportion to the number and weight of the causes, whether real or pretended, which provoke or invite them. If this remark be just, it becomes useful to inquire whether so many just causes of war are likely to be given by united America as by disunited America. I find this paragraph kind of interesting. Anyway, Jay says, for if it should turn out that united America will probably give the fewest, then it will follow that in this respect the Union tends most to preserve the people in a state of peace with other nations. In other words, what he's saying is, whether you have, like, however many wars you have depends on however many causes you have to cause those wars. Makes sense, right? If you have a bunch of little states, you have more opportunities to start a war, right? Like, you have more. Each of those states is going to be doing whatever it's going to be doing and might end up starting a war. Georgia might just decide on its own to start fighting Spain or something. So because of that, if you have one country, that's fewer countries to start wars. I love that because, like, it sounds dumb, but also it makes sense. I don't know. I don't know. Maybe it's just me. Anyway. Okay. Next paragraph. The just causes of war, for the most part, arise either from violations of treaties or from direct violence. America has already formed treaties with no less than 6 foreign nations, and all of them, except Prussia, are maritime, and therefore able to annoy and injure us. She has also extensive commerce with Portugal, Spain, and Britain, and with respect to the 2 latter has, in addition, the circumstance of neighborhood to attend to. It is of high importance to the peace of America that she observe the laws of nations toward all these powers, and to me it appears evident that this will be more perfectly and punctually done by one national government than it could be either by 13 separate states or by 3 or 4 distinct confederacies. Because when once an efficient national government is established, the best men in the country will not only consent to serve, but also will generally be appointed to manage it. For although town or country or other contracted influence may place men in state assemblies or senates or courts of justice or executive departments, yet more general and extensive reputation for talents and other qualifications will be necessary to recommend men to offices under the national government, especially as it will have the widest field for choice, and never experience that want of proper persons which is not uncommon in some of the states. Hence it will result that the administration, the political councils, and the judicial decisions of the national government will be more wise, systematical, and judicious than those of individual states, and consequently more satisfactory with respect to other nations, as well as more safe with respect to us. In other words, this very simple idea Jay is saying here if you have a national government, you have a bigger pool to draw from for your personnel who work in diplomacy. Each individual state, if it's operating as an independent country, will only have so many people within it that might have qualifications to work in diplomacy. But if you have the whole country, you're necessarily going to have the best and brightest from all of them working in diplomacy on behalf of all of them. A small state like Rhode Island or Georgia would not necessarily be able to, draw on a very deep pool of talent, therefore could make mistakes in foreign affairs. But united in this one united country, they get the benefit of the National Foreign Affairs Bureau, Foreign Affairs Secretary, who would later become the Secretary of State, that ended up becoming. They get the benefit of the best of that talent, along with all the other states. Because under the national government, treaties and articles of treaties, as well as the laws of nations, will always be expounded in one sense and executed in the same manner, whereas adjudications on the same points of questions in 13 states or in 3 or 4 confederacies will not always accord or be considered. And that is well from the variety of independent courts and judges appointed by different and independent governments, as from the different local laws and interests which may affect and influence. The wisdom of the convention in committing such questions, jurisdiction and judgment of courts appointed by and responsible only to one national government cannot be too much commended. Because the prospect of present loss or advantage may often tempt the governing party in 1 or 2 states to swerve from good faith and justice, but those temptations not reaching the other states, consequently having little or no influence on the national government, the temptation will be fruitless, good faith and justice be preserved. The case of the Treaty of Peace with Britain adds great weight to this. So here in this section, he's talking about how an individual state might get itself into a war with a foreign power like Britain or Spain. Because of the government, you have a smaller population, a very bellicose faction within that state might get power and do something or whatever. Whereas the federal government would be less likely to be swayed in that direction, fight a war. I'm not claiming that all the arguments that John Jay is going to make or that the people in general in the Federalist Papers are going to make are going to be good arguments. But that's an argument that John Jay is making here. Yeah, it's funny. Rhode Island, as Sousa said, Rhode Island, they really didn't want to join the Union. They were the last ones to ratify. They waited a long time. They didn't ratify until 1791, well after everybody else. I mean, North Carolina was another holdout, but North Carolina came in 1790. But Rhode Island had to be cajoled. They really were going to try to go on, which is kind of a fun history thing to imagine. What if Rhode Island had remained independent? Not that the U.S. would have. Yes, Pilot, that's exactly his argument. Big countries means no war. Are you convinced yet? Anyway, let's move on. Where was I? Okay, I think I'm here. Because even if the governing party in a state should be disposed to resist such temptations, yet as such temptations may or commonly do result from circumstances peculiar to the state, and may affect a great number of the inhabitants, the governing party may not always be able, if willing, to prevent the injustice meditated or to punish the aggressors. But the national government, not being affected by those local circumstances, will neither be induced to commit the wrong themselves, nor want power or inclination to prevent or punish its commission by others. So, for example, New York, maybe there'd be a big faction in New York that would want to go and invade Canada and take over Montreal or something. New York as a state might not be able to prevent that from happening. And it can happen in one of 2 ways, he's saying here. Either it could be a small faction, or like a faction of the state gets control of the state government and makes the state government go and do that. Or even if the state government doesn't play along and is not condoning that action, a faction of people within that state might just go off and do it on their own, and the state would not have the means to prevent them, or for political reasons might not even be opposed to preventing them, or might not even be inclined to prevent them. But according to John Jay here, in a federal government, all those little local um, interests, those little local movements to try and go and attack a foreign power for no reason, go pick a fight with Britain or Spain, those interests would be diluted because of such a big country. They'd be a small voice within a much bigger country. And then the bigger country, as it would have a stronger, it would just be, it would be easier for it to keep those forces under. This is actually something that would happen. I don't know if it was happening in the 1780s, but this was a thing that happened sometimes in the early republic, where people would just go off and like start trouble. Oh, like they would leave the borders of the country and go off. Like there was the Wilkinson thing during the Jefferson administration, where he went down into West Florida and you know, caused problems there. There was, I guess, the Texians are probably an example of it. I don't know. That it's a little bit different because they had been settled. But so he's not just like, this isn't just an abstract thing. This is a thing that actually happened in the U.S. Okay. Realist theory. I agree. That about what would Jay think 200 years later. I think, yeah, he was a Federalist through and through, and I think he would be. I think the Federalists in general would be less disturbed by what the government became than um, than the Republicans would have been. But I think both sides back then, even and including John Jay, as Federalist as he was, I'm not sure how he would feel. I don't know enough about him. How he would feel about just how different governments are today compared to the way it was really unusual, right? It just they could not have imagined that the scope of powers and the scope of responsibilities that a modern government has, not just the U.S. government, but governments, things have changed a lot the past 200. Where was I? Okay. So far, therefore, as either designed or accidental violations of treaties and the laws of nations afford just causes of war, they are less to be apprehended under one general government than under several lesser ones, and in that respect the former most favors the safety of the people. As to those just causes of war which proceed from direct and unlawful violence, it appears equally clear to me that one good national government affords vastly more security against dangers of that sort than can be derived from any other quarter. Because such violences are more frequently caused by the passions and interests of a part than of the whole, of one or two states than of the Union. Not a single Indian war has yet been occasioned by aggressions of the present federal government, feeble as it is. And by when he's referring to the federal government, he's referring to the Articles of Confederation. But there are several instances of Indian hostilities having been provoked by the improper conduct of individual states, who, either unable or unwilling to restrain or punish offenses, have given occasion to the slaughter of many innocent inhabitants. And yeah, those early conflicts between white settlers and the Indians, I'll just call them Indians, indigenous people, it was not a top down thing where the government would be like, okay, let's go take that territory away from them. It was a more of a bottom up thing where individual settlers would go into an area and start settling in an area, and then start having clashes with the local indigenous people. Then that would escalate. The back and forth would escalate, and the state would either not do anything about it, or would be just lackadaisical about handling the situation. Um, and then end up with, of course, virtually every case, the encounter being forced off. And there were a lot of treaties that were being signed where the Indians would cede over part of their land or some area of land to the state. The states that abutted up to the frontier area, like New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and so on, they would enter into treaties with indigenous nations, and where the indigenous nation would cede their territory. The treaties were kind of problematic because the way the states were approaching it, and back in the 1780s and previously, these were between individual states or individual colonies and the Indian. But when, from the standpoint of the whites, they were signing a treaty, and they were thinking of it in terms of European practice, where you sign a treaty, like two sovereigns would sign a treaty. Of course, we're talking about back in the 1700s, where sovereigns, kings, were signing treaties with each other. They would sign a treaty, and then the people under that sovereign would be obligated to abide by that treaty. And that was just the culture that the Europeans had. And so, for example, when, like in the colonial wars in the 1700s, when territories would be swapped back and forth, like Florida, for example, was Spanish, and then the Spanish, at the end of the 7 Years' War, ceded it to the British. Florida, the two Floridas. And then 20 years later, the British ceded it back to Spain. If you were a Spaniard in Florida in 1763, you had no choice in the matter. You were obligated legally to go along with it. Either you vacated Florida if you wanted to stay part of Spain under Spanish rule, or you just accepted the fact that now you're going to be a British subject. That was just European culture. But for the Indians, it wasn't like that. The chiefs did not have that kind of coercive power over their people. So you might get a bunch of chiefs together and have them sign a treaty, and those chiefs and some of their followers would abide by the treaty. But then you'd have other Indians from that same nation who are like, I don't agree with the treaty, and it doesn't apply to me. And from the Indian standpoint, that was a perfectly valid perspective to have. But from the Americans, or the colonial period, it would have been the New Yorkers, etc. They were like, we signed a treaty fair and square. You're not abiding by the treaty. And so then they would send in a punitive expedition and punish the Indians who were like, what would happen is they would sign the treaty. They would say, okay, this territory, according to the treaty, this territory is now open to white settlement. Then whites would start settling in there. Some of the Indians and the chiefs who signed that treaty would be like, okay, we signed this treaty. Okay, this is what we're doing. And they moved west. Then there'd be other Indians in that same nation who'd be like, I'm not going along with this. They would stay in the territory and they would attack the white settlers and they would kill white civilians. And then the whites would like, we signed a treaty fair and square. These particular Indians, they wouldn't generalize and say all Indians. Say these particular Indians are violating the treaty. We need to go punish these particular, and they would go and fight them. And then oftentimes white settlers would take it into their own hands to exact retribution on Indians. But then oftentimes, like on the frontier, they didn't necessarily make a distinction. And so they would just go to an Indian village, and kill people there. Well, they'd be like, well, they killed white people, go to an Indian village and kill the Indians. But the people in that village may not have had anything to do with that raid. And it was complicated. I'm just saying that's the context of what he's saying here. This is pretty much reflective of what was going on, where he sees, it's a little bit like not a single Indian war has been occasioned by aggressions by the present federal government. Well, yeah, the Articles of Confederation only was around for about a decade. And yeah, feeble as it was feeble. But then he notes there are several instances of Indian hostilities having been provoked by the improper conduct of individual states, who either unable or unwilling to restrain or punish offenses have given occasion to the slaughter of many innocent inhabitants. So he's suggesting here that if there was a stronger central government, a stronger federal government, it would be able to deal with the Indians more effectively than individual states would. Perhaps we'd be able to constrain those white vigilantes, and then we'd have more peace on the frontier. And that is basically what Washington tried to do during his presidency. Washington has kind of a complicated. There's this whole Indian policy side of Washington's presidency that I want to explore actually in a video at some point. But yeah, he was trying to deal with those issues that Jay is alluding. All right, the neighborhood of Spanish and British territories, bordering on some states and not on others, naturally confines the causes of quarrel more immediately to the borderers. The bordering states, if any, will be those who, under the impulse of sudden irritation and a quick sense of apparent interest or injury, will be most likely by direct violence to excite war with those nations. And nothing can so effectually obviate that danger as a national government, whose wisdom and prudence will not be diminished by the passions which actuate the parties immediately interested. So in other words, what he's saying here is states on the border of Spain and on the border of Britain, on the Spanish colonies and the British colonies, are much more likely to pick fights with the British and the Spanish than a national government is. Because a national government will have voices and influence the whole country, not just people. But not only fewer just causes of war will be given by the national government, but it will also be more in their power to accommodate and settle them amicably. It will be more temperate and cool, and in that respect, as well as in others, will be more in capacity to act advisedly than the offending state. The pride of states, as well as of men, naturally disposes them to justify all their actions, and opposes their acknowledging, correcting, or repairing their errors and offenses. National government, in such cases, will not be affected by this pride, but will proceed with moderation and candor to consider and decide on the means most proper to extricate them from the difficulties which threaten them. Not sure if that. I think that paragraph would probably have made more sense back then than it makes now, because back then people. I mean, I feel like this paragraph's pretty clear, but basically he's saying a state is more likely to act improperly and refuse to back down, refuse to acknowledge when it makes a mistake in foreign affairs because of the heatedness of the passions of the people living there, whereas the federal government's going to be more calm and cool and collected about it. Now, back then, people had very strong state loyalties. And since there was no federal government yet, people didn't, or the federal government, the Articles of Confederation was much weaker. People didn't have such strong identity with the Articles of Confederation, Congress. Maybe when I first read this, I was like, "That's weird," but I'm kind of thinking about it. Maybe he has a point in the context of the time. Yeah, I agree. Pilot age like milk. I don't know if that'd be the case today. Besides, it is well known that acknowledgments, explanations, and compensations are often accepted as satisfactory from a strong, united nation, which would be rejected as unsatisfactory if offered by a state or confederacy of little consideration or power. In the year 1685, the state of Genoa, having offended Louis XIV, endeavored to appease him. He demanded that they should send their doge, or chief magistrate, accompanied by 4 of their senators, to France to ask his pardon and receive his terms. They were obliged to submit to it for the sake of peace. Would he on any occasion either have demanded or have received like humiliation from Spain or Britain or any other powerful nation? So he's playing on the pride, that state pride that people would have. You, as a New Yorker, as someone from Massachusetts, what are they called? Bay Staters or something? Or as a Virginian. Well, Virginia is a bad example because it was a big state at the time. Or a South Carolinian, would you want to have to humiliate yourself before a major power? Wouldn't you rather be a part of a big, powerful country that could potentially deal, perhaps not on equal terms with Britain at this point, but more so than South Carolina by itself would, or Jersey by itself would. All right, so that's the end of Federalist number 3. Let me see how we did on time. I've been trying to... Okay, not too bad. Trying to think, like, what is the right amount of the Federalist Papers to read a week. But I think this amount probably works. I'm going to try to have this finished by October, maybe? It's quite a long time. There are a bunch of Federalist Papers, though. But yeah. If you have any last-minute comments or questions, I can stick around for a minute and see if anybody has anything to say. And then we can wrap things up. We're going to have a couple more J treaty. Let me actually look here at my... this doesn't tell me how many J's we have. I think we have about... Let me cheat in Wikipedia. I think we have 5 J essays at the beginning. I know that you can't see this. I'm just going to take a quick look at... oh, no. There are 4 J treaties at the beginning. We've done 2 of them. There will be 2 more next week. I'll do 2 more J treaties. I have that on the brain because of another video. 2 more J essays next week, and then... Oh, let me find out. Yes. The next week it'll be 2 J essays, and then another essay by Hamilton. Is what I have on plan. On Tuesday, yeah, empire did not have a bad connotation. Oh yeah, I should. Yeah, that's a good idea. Thanks, Susa. I'll check that out. You know, about the Indiana Jones thing, I did the thing on Twitch where you can follow the game, and every once in a while I'll go on Twitch and I'll see someone's playing that same game, and I don't want to watch it for too long because the game I'm playing on Tuesday is Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis. I don't want to watch too long because I don't want to see a bunch of spoilers. I want to have, like, you know, the experience of, like, for the first time. But what I found interesting is every time I go and see that somebody's playing that game, it's always somebody in a foreign language. They're usually Spanish or Italian or something. Anyway, yeah, I'll check that out. But yeah, Pilot, Hamilton called the Union an empire near the beginning. Yeah, the word empire did not have a negative connotation in the 18th century. Yeah, and people at the time, who was it, called the U.S. an empire of liberty. One of the founding fathers, was it Jefferson? I think Jefferson called it Empire of Liberty. Yes. I should probably set up a scene where you can see me media. But yeah, Thomas Jefferson came up with the phrase Empire of Liberty in 1780, while the revolution was still happening. Okay. All right. So, well, yes, basically, empire used to mean government that ruled over multiple kingdoms. Yes, pretty much. Yeah. There really was only one. Well, let me think. I mean, there was the Holy Roman Empire. That was an empire. And then the Russians adopted the title of emperor. I think it was Peter the Great, right? So that was beginning of the 18th century. They adopted that term. But yeah, but it's just like yeah, incorporating other kingdoms inside of it. Yeah, the title of emperor outranked the title of king. You know, the nice thing about doing this is I don't have to do tests. I don't have to write a test and I don't have to grade it. That's the best thing about this. I never minded the teaching part of it, but boy, I did not always enjoy the grading part, or the grading could be a bit of a slog sometimes. And coming up with questions is hard too, man. Uh, um, I don't know. If I feel inspired, I might actually make a test. We'll see. Maybe I could do that at the end or something. All right, I'll go ahead and end the stream now. I'm gonna post this on the YouTube channel. I'm gonna make the video unlisted, but the playlist will be public. I think that's how that works. So then you'll be able to access the playlist under the playlist tab. I streamed this. If I got the settings right, we'll see. What I tried to make happen, what I meant to do, was that this streamed at 720p, but I recorded it also at 1080p, and I'm going to upload the 1080p version. But anyway, yeah, that's the plan. We'll see if I got my settings right. Well, can you post a link for it in the Discord? Oh yeah, good idea. I should remind me if I don't. If it isn't up by tomorrow, remind me about it and I'll post it. All right. Well, thanks for joining me. I'll go ahead and end the stream now. See y'all later. Bye.